Hey guys, my name is Phil and I have a podcast called The Moto Beamer Show where we bring on interesting motorcycle enthusiasts and we talk about their lives as it relates to motorcycles or any other sort of topics related to that. Today, we're talking to Brook Reams, who restored a vintage 1983 BMW R80 ST. And Brook has partnered with the BMW MOA Foundation to help raffle this motorcycle off with proceeds going to the Motorcycle Relief Project. So I will make sure to link down to everything we discuss and I talk about down below. But tickets are on sale through March 10th of 2024, with the winner being picked on March 16th, 2024, live, location to be determined. Complete rules and details are available at bmwmoaf.org. Once again, the link down there is below. So the Motorcycle Relief Project is a 501c3 nonprofit. I actually had the distinct pleasure to interview Mike Bobbitt, the president of the Motorcycle Relief Project. What an outstanding organization that provides aid to veterans and first responders suffering from PTSD and other related symptoms. It does this by taking them on week-long adventure motorcycle rides. So you literally have the trifecta. You've got Brook Reams, who restored this amazing bike. You've got the BMW MOA, who wants to raffle this off. And you have the Motorcycle Relief Project, who will be the beneficiary of all of these good deeds and efforts. So last little bit before we get into this podcast, I met Brook for coffee before going over to his shop to view this bike in person, which is amazing, by the way. And it struck me that I needed to spend some time on this podcast talking about Brook, or letting Brook talk about his life as a motorcyclist in general. He has had amazing, amazing experiences through the course of his life. And I thought I'd be remiss without allowing him to share those with us. So the first part of the podcast will be dedicated to Brook, his exploits, some good times and some good stories. And then we'll pivot to the R80 ST, its restoration efforts, everything he's proud of, and all the people that are involved. So please enjoy this podcast. Leave your comment down below. Leave a question for Brook if you want. I'm sure he'll answer them. Guys, thank you for watching. Enjoy. All right, everybody, welcome to the show. We have Brook Reams on the show, the Moto Beamer Show. Brook, welcome.
Thank you.
I am excited for this episode because, we had coffee last week at your favorite coffee shop. And it just struck me as, yes, we are going to talk about your motorcycle, the R80 ST, the beautiful rebuild that's behind you, that the BMW MOA is raffling off. That's proceeds are going to the Motorcycle Relief Project. And, I just want to interject. Anybody that's interested in this bike needs to go to your YouTube channel and watch the series that you produced on this. Absolutely incredible. But we are going to get into that. But it struck me while we, had coffee and after we talked to your shop that we would be missing out if we didn't learn about the life of Brook Reams, the motorcyclist. I mean, absolutely incredible. So, it's hard to condense everything you've done and learned and passed on in an hour, but I hope we can do it some justice. We'll spend the first part of this interview talking about yourself and some of the stories that I really enjoyed hearing from you. And then we can transition and talk about the rebuild and all the things, wonderful things you're doing there. Does that sound good?
Sure.
So you have a section on your blog called Musings, which I found incredibly interesting. I read it a few times. And you start off, you're really good. You hook the reader in and you talk about 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2 and kind of how context relates to motorcycling. I found that fascinating, and I was hoping that I could get you to dig into that a little bit. Why does 1 + 1 not equal 2?
Well, as I solve problems, context and assumptions sometimes get in your way. And so I wrote that little article to challenge things that everybody thinks are absolutely true. And the first one was 1 + 1 = 2. And I said, only if we agree on the symbols 1 + = 2, okay, most people do. And then I came up with an example which violates that assumption. I said, take a drop of water, drop another drop on top of it. How many drops of water? 1. So 1 + 1 = 1 in that context. The reason I did that was just to make a point that sometimes when you're working on a bike, you have assumptions and you don't challenge them. And you try to get something to work and it won't work. And occasionally you've got a faulty assumption. meaning you think you know something, but in fact, it's not the case in this particular situation. And that's difficult because our assumptions are embedded, and it's very hard sometimes to understand what your assumptions are and to prove that they're all correct. So what I've done on occasion is I get stumped. I can't get something to go the way I want. I'll just start to write down what I think is true. And interestingly enough, in several cases, I'll look at one of those and go, well, now I wonder if that's actually the case. Let me go dig into that. And more than once, I've said, oh, that isn't the situation. Ah, that's why I'm having trouble. So I tried to write that little article as a shakeup to say, when you get stuck, sometimes stop, don't do any more work, but think about what you believe is true. And you may find something you think is true isn't. And that's the key to getting past the problem. So that's what that little piece was about.
I love how you say you write down all your assumptions. I've seen it where you deal in facts and assumptions, but you're like, I want to write down everything, no matter how absurd it might be. Is that correct?
Yeah. So sometimes, like, to give an example, I'm trying to diagnose a problem in an electrical system. And one of the assumptions is the wire connecting is intact. The insulation is intact. Well, you don't know that to be true. And one interesting thing I found one time was I had corrosion in the wire, but it was this far inside the insulation, and it was making make and break contact. The assumption was, I looked at the wire, it must be good. The answer is it had a failure. So challenging the assumption helped me go find the source of the problem.
I really like that methodology. I think somebody like me and maybe others like me would not stop and write assumptions down, but rather start to buy parts and throw parts at the problem.
Well, that's the other way to go, but it can get expensive.
Absolutely. You did have one other thing, and we'll kind of pivot away from the musings, but you had another piece called The Misery of Time. And when I started to read, I'm like, what does this mean? The misery of time. And then you talked about how that related to your builds and how, you kind of realized you had a little bit of self-realization, like, wow, the misery of time. So if you want to go into that, I thought that was really neat too.
Well, yeah, it was interesting. I wrote that little article about my early days of keeping a bike running. I didn't have a garage, and I'd work at the curb, and I had to be finished because I didn't have any other transportation. And I'd run into a problem, and I'd have to go put the bike back together to go to the parts, to a dealer to get a part and come back, take it all apart and work on it again. But I was always under time pressure because I had to be ready to go use it the next day. And then that hit me on one of the rebuilds. It was the 1977 R100 RS I stumbled on. And it came up, and I went and bought it. And I wanted to take it to Todd Trumbore's 40th anniversary of the R100 RS. I wanted to ride it out to Pennsylvania from here in Colorado. I had 12 months to get everything done. And I worked very diligently, and of course had to send some stuff out to get work done, paint work and other things that I wasn't capable of. And boy, as the time ticked away, the pressure went up. And to be clear, when I got done, I did get done. I did ride out there and rode back. But it struck me, you didn't really enjoy this build very much. And I got thinking about that. And the answer is, you were under a time clock and you had to be done. And that actually, in my mind, creates a misery. If you can work at your own pace, and if you're getting tired or something's not going right, it's great to be able to just sit down, take a break, go away from it, as I like to say, get a coffee, get a beer, sit down, let your mind unravel, and then rethink the problem. And frequently you'll come up with what you're doing wrong. And that's the luxury of time. And that actually brings joy because you don't feel like I got to be done regardless. I'm done and it's perfect. That makes it much more enjoyable.
How did you, this might be a little bit of life advice, because that's one thing if you're dealing with a motorcycle build that's sitting in your shop, but you had a long career as an engineer, and I'm sure you had deadlines, and like we all do. How did
Yep.
you reconcile that? How did you make sure that the misery of time didn't creep in into your lifestyle that way?
Well, it did every now and then, but I
Right.
actually adopted a model as I got older. I didn't implement a solution until the very latest moment. And
Hmm.
I'd sit and think and play around with the problem, consider alternatives, and take as long as I could before I actually went ahead with one of those options. And in many ways, the whole thing got done on time because I considered alternatives and generally found one that was effective, efficient, and could be done quickly. Whereas if you immediately grab something which pops in your head, not often is that the best one to do. And it ends up with trouble and problems, and you got to go work overly hard to get over the hurdles. So I kind of developed a discipline of just waiting as long as I could before I actually implement something. So that was part of how I tried to keep sane in the corporate world.
So if you arrive at let's say you consider all the, and we didn't plan on going down this path, but I find this very interesting. If you consider all the options and you're 51% one way, 49% the other way, do you always take the 51 or no?
Well, that's a good question. The other piece of it is how do you feel? What is your aesthetic?
Mm,
Uh, and often some of the solutions didn't seem aesthetically pleasing. And that's my first clue. They're probably not the path to take. I find that's interesting because many engineers don't think of beauty and artistry in their thinking. But in my opinion, those are very important principles, and they often frame the right decision. It feels like it'll be a better piece of work if I take that path. So I have
interesting.
kind of moved in that direction over time.
I think that's huge. I mean, there is the aesthetics, how you feel. Would you be working on that bike if you thought it was incredibly ugly? I don't know if you would. Maybe.
Well, the goal was to convert the ugly into beauty. So
Right.
there's enjoyment in that. Yes, in all of the projects,
Hmm.
they need some reinvigoration, if you will.
Yes.
And having that image in my head of what I want when I'm done really helps guide the process. And
Absolutely.
it helps you do good work, quite bluntly.
And you're talking about your work, and we're going to kind of bounce back and forth. I think one thing in speaking with you and watching your videos and reading your blog, when I tend to think of a restoration project, you conjure up, some show on whatever TV channel, and it's like they blaze through it in 30 minutes. And, we go from rolling chassis ugly to what you have behind you. And I think what your channel and everything that's involved in it shows or showcases is the incredible amount of work and detail that you put into it. And one quick example of that is I clicked on the video that said first startup. I'm like, this is going to be an exciting thing because he's just going to fire the motorcycle up. You literally had like a pre-space shuttle launch checklist going through everything before you even turn the ignition. And I was like, man, that is super incredible. Just a level of extreme detail that you go through.
Yeah, because to be honest with you, you've worked on it for maybe a year or more, and it's worth going back and confirming you really did everything you should have. And every now and then, when I go through that kind of a check, I'll find something I screwed up.
Yes,
And, you want that out of the way so the engine start is a success. And you're not
absolutely.
having to fight that.
Yeah, that was very eye opening, and just the level of detail. Like I can confirm visually, there's oil here. Excuse me. I can confirm this and that. So again, getting a little ahead of myself, but you did mention, the last build or the last project, one of the last ones, you rode to PA and back when we talked about the misery of time. And during those discussions, we talked about your relationship with the Iron Butt Association, which I found fascinating. I think you said you have well over 300,000 miles in the saddle. You've got a lot of long distance trips. What I really found interesting was some of your very early trips, which might have, kind of got you clued in on the Iron Butt. But you're on this, what is it, Kawasaki, and you're driving across the country with no gear, and you're lacking sleep, hallucinating. I don't know if you want to get into some of those, but I thought some of those were just interesting because you didn't have cell phones and GPS and even like waterproof gear. This was the early days.
Yeah, the first adventure was I left New Haven, Connecticut, to go to college in Las Cruces, New Mexico, at New Mexico State. I already finished 2 years in New Haven, but I wanted to go back to New Mexico where I lived as a child. And I bought a 350 Kawasaki triple, otherwise known as the S2. And the bike before that was a 200cc Boltaco Matraya. Anyhow, I loaded it up to the gills with most of my possessions, tools, two-stroke oil cans, etc., and took off. And I left at the tail end of a tropical storm and learned that when you buy a rain suit, you should sit down and be sure the pant legs cover the top of your boots. And these didn't. So the water was just flowing out of my shoes. And I basically got hypothermic and had to stop about 200 miles somewhere in the middle of Pennsylvania. So a good lesson, definitely.
I mean, we right now, most of the gear we ride in is impervious, right? Gore-Tex and all the things.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, what was it like back then?
Well,
in the elements.
Yeah, you didn't have Gore-Tex, but you had to trust rubber, and getting all the closures tight didn't generally work out well. So you tended to get a little bit damp.
Yeah, just par for the course. That's what happens. I mean, we kind of touched on it a little bit, and in your videos, you're very meticulous and reading your sort of Iron Butt exploits. I mean, you have everything spreadsheet. If you're riding across the country down to the wire, time hacks, oil usage, all the things. And then I noticed, and you might be able to go into this a little bit, when things, you make a plan, as we say in the military, no plan survives first contact. So you make a plan, things tend to go awry. Even though everything is laid out, you seem to have a good way to adjust and just sort of pick up the slack and make it work, right?
Well, yeah, you have to be creative when something goes sideways, like a stop takes too long. Well, you can maybe adjust the next stop to be a little shorter, or your day is going to be a little longer. So it's a little bit of how you, as you point out, the plan guides you, but it doesn't protect you from everything that could happen. And sometimes you have to adjust mid-course in order to stay on the time clock for finishing so many miles within the allotted time. That's true. Yeah.
And so your stateside exploits, if you go to the far end of the spectrum, I think we get into what you call combat touring, where you're touring in Europe and it is anything but as meticulously laid out as you would like, right? I think you have some great articles on your blog where you talk about touring in Europe, but if you want to cover those a little bit, I thought those stories were incredibly fun.
Well, I did do a ride through what used to be called Yugoslavia. So it's a whole bunch of little countries now with a tour group. And one of the interesting things was the transformation of traffic. We ended up with people, trucks, carts with horses and mules, rideable lawnmowers, all jammed together on the road. And nobody thinks anything about, shall we say, speed limits or the rules of the road. So
Mm.
you end up having to just sort of go with the flow and figure it out when you first get into the middle of all that.
Yeah,
And that was quite interesting.
I think, and you detailed it, and I saw some pictures. I think it was like a donkey in a cart or something. But
Yeah.
we ride here in the States, most of us, and then you've been, I think, in New Zealand, South Africa, the other places you've mentioned, and the lens by which we view life as motorcyclists here in the States can change drastically when you go to these countries where, I mean, it
Yes.
is extreme poverty. And you mentioned that in your writings. You've got a guy with a Mercedes right there, but then the next 2 miles is literally just nothing, right?
Yep.
Uh,
That was very fascinating. We would run into some, as you said, we ran into a case where a donkey was completely covered in hay, taking the hay from where it had been harvested to the farm all alone down a narrow road. And all you could see when I came around the corner was this hay bale moving forward and little feet underneath it. You don't see that in the US very often.
what did you take away from that? I mean, was it everything you thought it would be? Did you take anything back as far as perspective goes when all your travels to these other countries on a motorcycle?
Well, I do learn a lot, as you pointed out, of different cultures and norms and behaviors. And I find that enriching.
Hmm.
And in general, I do like to go with a tour group because the tour guides are typically very versed in where we are and what goes on, what the rules and norms of the culture are. And you learn so much, which I think if you're on your own, you probably don't learn it quite as well. So I really have enjoyed that opportunity to generally go with a tour group, and you just get a tremendous education, and it challenges the assumptions of what you have grown up with in the United States. It shows a different model of living. It's not inherently terrible, it's just different. And that's enlightening. It opens up your mind. So I always find that's very enjoyable.
Yeah, I think you're like you said, it opens up your mind. I think we, use projection. Everybody wants a Starbucks on the corner. Everybody wants what we have, and you go to these other countries. And just to be clear, I've never done a motorcycle tour overseas, but you go to these other countries, and you're like, maybe they don't want what we want. Maybe they seem a lot happier. Getting kind of down a different path, but I think it's super interesting, especially to see it on the back of two wheels, and sometimes falling off two wheels, which you have a great story called the Biff. Is this right? Biff in Bulgaria. Is that it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And then you describe in extreme detail, almost slow motion, what caused that accident. And I thought that was pretty fun.
yeah, yeah. It wasn't expected. It was the first day of the tour. I
Mm-hmm.
was going around to pass a guy on a Ducati Multistrada who was part of our group, and his wife was on the back. And I guess he saw me in his rearview mirror, and he grabbed a handful of throttle while he was leaned into a corner, and the
Mm.
bike just went right out from under him. And I'm confronted with three things moving across the road: the bike, he, and his wife. And I'm trying to miss them all. And I didn't hit them. And then unfortunately, his bike started spinning and it pushed me off the road. And I went down and had a dislocation of my shoulder. Anyhow, I got taken to an emergency room. As I was sitting on the gurney looking up, there were no ceiling tiles in the hospital.
Mm.
All the wiring was exposed. It looked like 1930s.
Oh, wow.
And, I got x-rayed, and the x-ray machine made so much noise, it made me a little nervous. I wondered just how much x-ray am I getting? In any event, the good
Right.
news was they brought in a orthopedic guy. They looked at the x-ray, and I had earlier, 40 years ago, completely separated this same shoulder.
Mm.
So they were looking at it, talking in Bulgarian, and I made an observation to them. please realize that that shoulder was damaged 40 years ago. And he turned around and looked at me and he said, oh, that's good. We thought you'd done all that this time. We'll let you out of here. So I figured I'd have to pay the hospital bill.
Right.
And I asked, how much do I owe? And I figured, it's midnight in America. How in the heck am I going to get my insurance company and all? And the attending physician looked at me and he says, no, you don't understand. You don't owe us anything. All medical services in Bulgaria are free, even though you're an American citizen. There's no bill. I said, really? He said, yep, it's free. Now let me get you something to immobilize your arm. Wow. He had a 1-inch wide piece of gauze he wrapped around my neck and around my wrist. And I said, yes, if it's free, you don't get a full sling, you get a little bit of gauze.
That's
event, the other thing that was exciting was the other couple were there with me.
Right.
They got prescriptions for pain and other things. And I asked the doctor, can I get a pain prescription? He says, no, you don't need it. You can use theirs.
Oh.
I said, you're kidding. He says, yeah, the prescription is good anywhere for anybody. Now, you don't run into that in the United States.
Right.
So we all went to the pharmacy and picked up what we needed off that one prescription and used it 2 or 3 more times because I didn't take the prescription from you. You were allowed to keep it. So very interesting. Different cultural norms.
This kind of segues great into my next question, I think, because it is different. And everything, and we can talk a little bit about it if you want, but, everything from you riding your motorcycle to go to races here, whatever that was 30, 40 years ago, to all the trips you've taken, to the bikes you've restored. And as a motorcyclist yourself, how has all of this shaped or helped you view the world as, through the lens of a motorcyclist and all the incredible things you've done and experienced?
Well, I like to say I got addicted in 1970 and I've never shook it. And I found over time that riding a motorcycle puts me in the moment, and it tends to remove thinking about problems in the future or unpleasantnesses of the past. It's a bit like Zen. You're in the moment. And if you're really riding comfortably, there's no separation between you and the machine. It's a natural extension of you. And I find that is just enormously soothing. I refer to it as my mental therapy. I find it really makes me feel very, very enjoy the experience and calm when I get off. And I think that may have been why I got into doing some of those iron butt rides of 1,000 miles in a day. And I did one 1,500 miles in a day and a half. And I did one with 2,000 miles in 2 days. But I enjoyed the experience, actually. It was quite relaxing, odd to say, but it was.
So I have not done an iron, but I did, like I think we talked about, I did 986 miles from Arkansas to Colorado. I was less than 20 miles short, and I said, I'm just tired. I'm going home. So fail on that one. But when you're doing 1,000, 1,500, 2,000, some people choose to listen to music or podcasts, and you didn't have that back then, I don't think. What goes through your mind? Like because you did talk about sort of a status check on if you can do arithmetic, right? It stops, like, am I tired enough or, fresh enough to continue? But when you're doing 1,500, 2,000 miles, what are you just looking at the scenery, or what keeps you stimulated to go for that long?
Well, it's often the scenery and the experience. Sometimes, I'll think about something enjoyable, but I never ever play music or any of that because that's a distraction from being in the moment. And to me, being in the moment is what I'm after. And that calms me down and makes me feel very complete. And that's what I enjoy most about riding. I call it synthesis. It brings everything together and it's nice and smooth. And I still say when I get in the groove, when I'm really relaxed, everything, I might think I need to, lean the bike just automatically leans. There's
Mm.
hardly any separation between what I want and what happens. It's just so smooth. And that to me is enjoyable.
Do you achieve that same state of, I guess, Zen, uh, maybe in a little bit different way, but when you are wrenching on bikes, when you are restoring, when you are working for hours in your shop?
Well, you put your finger on the other method. And to me, you do work comfortably and with an aesthetic of good quality. You can get into a flow exactly like riding, and it's just smooth. Everything basically goes without hiccup, and you're in the moment. Robert Pirsig wrote a book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. The three words that matter are Zen, art, maintenance. He brings them all together. And he
Mm.
points out the satisfaction that you get when you're totally involved with the work. You're influencing the machine and it's influencing you. It's a two-way connection. And that's very satisfying. And as I said earlier about riding, the bike becomes part of me. When I do shop work, what I'm working on, it kind of becomes a part of me. It's an
Right.
extension of me. And that's very comforting. So I do enjoy that. Now, I don't know if everybody goes through that experience, but it is a lot of why I do enjoy doing these rebuilds and restores.
You talk about the bike speaking to you, but before because I do have a question about that. If I were to ask you to, and you might have already done this, but I don't think I asked you directly, define Zen or your Zen. What is that?
Well, it's being in the moment and flowing.
Hmm.
It's not static. You're moving and you're reacting to all that's around you. And in some respects, it's reacting to you. So another way to say that is the artificial separation of you from what's around you
Hmm.
dissolves, and it's all one thing. That to me is very uh, enjoyable and joyous. It's a great feeling. Now, many people refer to that as getting into the flow, which is a good word because it's dynamic,
Right.
but you are a part of what you're working on, and it's a part of you. It's not controlling it. It often speaks to you if you'll listen
Hmm.
about what you should do next. It'll often tell you, at least me, when I get done. And sometimes I'll look at what I've done and go, that's okay. If I say that, it's not.
Mm.
It's not as good as it should be. But sometimes I say, nah, it's okay. I come back the next day, look at it and go, no, we're going to take that apart and do it again because it wasn't quite aesthetically whole as it should have been, which is an expression of what Zen really means to me.
Do you think that when you talk about the bike speaking back to you and Zen and all these, it's more than just a machine. Do you think that with respect to, say, the personality that a motorcycle has, the bikes that are behind you, the older sort of bikes have more personality than, say, my 2021 GS Adventure? Do you think there's something there?
Well, I'm biased in that regard. I'm an
Hmm.
old guy too, so I do have a personality. um, but I do find each one of the bikes, my wife and I had six of them at one time. But when you'd ride them, I would have to adjust a little what I do, how I do it, in recognition of the way that bike performed best. And
Mm.
they're all just a little different. In that respect, I like to use the word personality because if you're working and talking with a person, you understand if you know them, kind of how they're put together, and your interaction is to be complementary, not uh, to push them around or anything. You want to be close. So you'll behave just a little different with each person in recognition of their personality. and attempting to have a good relationship. I guess I feel somewhat the same about inanimate things like motorcycles.
Yeah. It, and this sets it up perfectly because you actually name your motorcycles after Muppets, correct?
Yeah, I loved I loved Jim Henson's Muppets and Sesame Street,
Mm-hmm.
and I just kind of well the story is whatever color the bike is, I try to pick a Muppet character of the same color, and it tends to be the one I think fits. So I've got Gonzo, Grover, uh, we had Elmo, I've got Cookie Monster, and in many ways, I feel like that's somewhat of a reflection of the way I behave on them when I ride them.
Well, it's a good thing you haven't had an Oscar the Grouch.
Well, that's the one I'm waiting for is to get a green BMW, and then that'll be Oscar.
and you actually have little figurines mounted on each bike, right? Not just the name, you have the figurine.
Yeah, I did that, and I told my wife the reason I do that, dear, is because if I'm riding for a long time, I'll start talking to the Muppet character,
Mm.
you know, and if he starts talking back, it's time to stop.
Yeah, I think that's one way to do it. I think if we had, for all of us that have ridden for hours and hours or even days on end, if you had recordings of some of the stuff that we would either say or sing inside your helmet, other people would probably think, what is wrong with this person? I don't know.
Yeah. True enough.
Yeah. So the last thing I'll talk about is I do want to mention this, if they start talking back to you, obviously it's time to pull over, but you do have an interesting way to measure if you're fit enough to ride on these long trips. You say you do long arithmetic or something like that?
Well, yeah, one of the things that you can monitor is kind of your physical state on an iron butt kind of ride, but it's hard to monitor your mental, and it could get you in trouble. So what I came up with was every time I get gas, I compute the mileage in my head, which means I got to do division and 3-digit arithmetic.
Mm-hmm.
And if I find I can't come up with the answer, I just feel too tired to do the math. It's time to make that stop a whole lot longer. Maybe lie down next to the bike, close your eyes, and relax, because your brain is not really where it needs to be. And if your brain's not where it needs to be, you can get yourself in some bad situations. So that's kind of my little trick for figuring out if your mind is not on the right level.
Yeah, because I think the tendency is I can do another hour, I can do another 2 hours, but even on a motorcycle, even more than a car, I mean, you need everything to be sharp.
Yeah, the example of that was back in the 70s when I rode from Los Alamos, New Mexico to New Haven, Connecticut to see my folks and then see my girlfriend who became my wife. She was up in Massachusetts at the time. And I ended up riding starting at 5 in the morning in Missouri. And I was about halfway through Pennsylvania. And I figured I'll just keep going. I'll get to New Haven. It's about 2.5, 3 hours. And as I was on the Pennsylvania Turnpike and coming downhill, there was a tractor trailer way down the road in front of me. And the next thing I knew, it was about 100 feet in front of me. I never remembered gaining on him. I had basically zoned out completely. My brain was not in gear. I missed him and immediately pulled off and found a place to get some sleep. But that was the first object lesson. That was my first 1,000-mile day. Not that it was planned, it just kind of became a 1,000-mile day. And I did learn from that, man, if your upstairs is not working, you're going to get yourself in real trouble.
That had to be interesting. Well, not interesting, maybe a little bit terrifying. Open your eyes and
it was like, wow, where did that come from?
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yes.
I don't know if I've ever had any moments like that, but thankfully, I don't know. Yeah, zoning out on a bike. I have done the head nod a few times, and I'm like, okay, it's time to pull over because it's just not safe enough to ride. All right, guys. So here we are halfway through the podcast. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion so far. So just a quick reminder that the bike is being raffled off and that your opportunity to purchase a raffle ticket ends on the 10th of March, 2024. Once again, everything is linked down below. BMWMOAF.org is where you can find it. Side note, if you're interested in some of this cool BMW MOA swag that I'm wearing, this hoodie, it's probably one of the best hoodies I own, feels fantastic, or one of these very cool t-shirts. All can be found on the BMW MOA site. So now we get to the fun part where we talk about the restoration efforts on the 1983 R80 ST. Guys, thanks for sticking with us this far. Please enjoy the rest of the episode. If you really like what you see, if you really like the conversation, please hit that like, subscribe button. Helps the channel out. Enjoy the rest of the show. So when we talk about, this is a good time to transition. 1983 R80 ST. I was hoping you could kind of give everybody that's watching or viewing a little bit of history on the motorcycle in general. There's only 1,000, I think, brought to the U.S., and they're only produced for 2 years. So just a little bit about the motorcycle in general and why it's so special.
Well, it's a derivative of the GS, the R80 GS. So sort of a street model, hence the ST designation. There's a really great guy in the Airhead community called Tom Cutter. He's been with Airheads from the 70s, and he was on Udo Gettel's race team that won the first AMA production class races on the R90S. Long story short, he was part of a dealership in Staten Island, New York, after the GS arrived, and he took modifications to it to kind of convert it more to a street bike. And where he was also was a car dealership. So he would offer to customers a more street-like version, 19-inch front instead of 21-inch, and any paint color that the cars had, you could get your bike custom painted. And he found that there were a lot of people wanting to buy those modifications. Well, back in Germany, BMW was thinking about some changes toward a street bike. They got a hold of Tom. He went over and went through it with the marketing and engineering people, laid out what he'd done. And essentially the ST was created, and he got serial number 1 delivered to him personally.
Oh, wow.
And he hung on to that for an awfully long time. And as you said, it wasn't a great seller. They only sold about 1,000 in the US in 2 years, 83, 84 model year. Now I got involved with it because I wanted to do a build that was kind of around a GS, but they just gotten so expensive. And I also wanted to do a build which was for charity. I wanted to donate the bike, I sell the bike and send all the proceeds to a particular charity known as the Motorcycle Relief Project.
Yes.
So that, looking around, I thought, the ST is effectively very much like a GS, but they're not anywhere near as expensive. So I posted a note here at the local Colorado Airhead community website that I maintain, and a good friend of mine sent me a note in about 5 minutes. Yes, I know where there's an ST, and it's in the estate of Clem Sikowski. He's the guy who owned BMW Denver, and that's where I bought my very first BMW, an R75/6. Clem had died about 4 or 5 months before, and I just felt like, okay, the universe is whispering to me. If that bike's been sitting in Clem's, stash, but he never got to rebuild it, I ought to go work on that. And he supported me so much when I got into doing work with tools and advice. And I just felt like, okay, that's the ST we're going to go and bring back to life.
And so before we talk about, because there's amazing photos on your blog, on your website, the condition in which you found this motorcycle, motorcycle in parentheses or quotations. It wasn't a full motorcycle. What kind of life did it live with Clem or whoever it was prior to you receiving ownership of it?
Well, what was interesting is when I started posting on my website about the build, I got a connection from somebody who said that bike was the one my brother bought from Clem, and then he sold it to me, and then I sold it to another guy, and it ended up back at Clem's in trade for a new bike. And I thought, wow, that's just way too cool.
Mm-hmm.
You never know what serendipity is going to pop up on you when you do something like this. But I thought that was neat. And he actually sent me some pictures of what his brother had done to the bike. And he had painted the valve covers orange, the fork sliders blue. He felt it was too mundane, so he
Mm.
wanted to spice it up with color. And when I got the bike, there were all of that on it, which of course I wanted to bring it back to showroom, so got rid of all that. But it was so neat to run into the original owners, as it were. That was just way too cool.
Yeah, those pictures that you have are vintage, like the bike. I mean, it has lived a good life with many owners and circled all the way back to Clem and then put in your hands. And then you document receiving it. So you basically get a rolling chassis with a motor, some parts here and there. How do you, or how did you approach that? And you have a video where you document this is everything I've gotten. So when you have this machine and you have all the parts, you're like, where do you start from? Right? Because I
No,
feel like they're just like, could it be a little overwhelming for most people?
well, that's one of the things you don't want to have happen to you because then you're not thinking clearly.
Mm-hmm.
And big things you need to break down into pieces, sort of, so you can control it. So what I often do is when I get a bike for a project, I sit in the shop and look at it, and I take pictures, and I think about it, and then I go and build a spreadsheet by each major subcomponent: uh, engine, electrical, carburetor, etc., just like the BMW parts fiche. And I write down what I think I'm needing to do in each of those chunks of the machine in
Mm-hmm.
order to get it to look like the vision I had in my head. And that gives me a roadmap. Now, admittedly, when you dive in, sometimes you'll find things that you did not expect. In this case, the transmission had water in it and the gears had rusted, a lot of them. So I had to update my plan for the transmission rebuild that I did. I had to buy a bunch of additional gears, acquire them, I should say. And, that's kind of how it goes, but it's still pretty well controlled. And then if it's going to take a year or a while to finish, you don't have to worry. I keep that list and I check off as I do the work what I've done. And that helps keep me on a path to the completion. So I find that that helps you take something really large, but control it in pieces that you can understand and achieve the final objective you're after. In short, I'm an engineer.
That was going to, it's almost like we're playing off each other here because that was going to be my next question. I watched your cylinder compression spreadsheet video, which was incredible. And where did you learn? Was it just over time, self-taught? You're an engineer, obviously, but where did you learn how to do this to motorcycles?
Well, that's a good point. I started doing this kind of rebuild work in 2009 to teach me because I really had never done anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so each project, I often would identify work that I'd never done that I wanted to do. So I'd learn it. Now, the good news is there's all kinds of people around that I've run into, like Tom Cutter, Bob Fleischer, aka Snowbum, Bud Proven, uh, Matt Parkhouse, Matt Isles. These are all professionals,
Mm-hmm.
and they're all willing to talk to you and educate you. And that's how I chew away at learning on each project something I had not done before. And that's kind of been the metamorphosis of my growth of being able to do the work over the last, since 2009, quite a long time. And then I also take a look at tools I need, and I acquire some new tools generally with each project. So my tool base expands outward. And that's all part of the learning experience, which to me is all part of the fun, to teach yourself what you don't know.
To get in that Zen state? Are we circling back to that?
Yeah.
What has
When
been...
it kind of gets to that, then when you finish doing it and you knew you didn't know how, and you look at it and you go, okay, you learned how, it looks good. And there's a satisfaction from that, which is really enjoyable.
I was going to ask, what has stumped you the most? I guess generally or specifically speaking, in that project or any others, what was it where you're like, I really need to learn how to do this, but this is either more complex or there are things I don't understand. What has stumped you the most?
Well, I had never laced and trued spoke wheels before.
Oh.
So on this project, since that was the stock wheels, I started to try to figure out how to do that. And I found some information from Snowbum and, looked around on the internet and went ahead and tried to figure out how to do it. It took me 6 weeks to get what I thought were true wheels. It was a long learning experience because there's a bit of art to it as well as the technique, the technology. Mm-hmm. And I did document some of that on one of the videos. I sort of tried to show bits of what I learned and things that you might not think of that affect getting the wheel true. Having said that, that was a very laborious exercise. On the other hand, when I got done, I wasn't confident. And I took the wheels to Woody's Wheel Works here in Denver and asked them to retrue them for me. And then when I went to pick them up, I asked them how far out were they? And they said, well, they were very close. So I felt good about that.
Yeah, I was not expecting the wheels answer. I was expecting something in the internals of the motor or something like that, but that makes total sense. It's I've seen the bike in person. It's beautiful. It looks, I wasn't looking at motorcycle showrooms in 1983, but I would have to expect it's pretty darn close, if not better. So I thought about this question while you were talking. If somebody's going to win this motorcycle in about a month and a half or so, and if you were standing next to that person and they're receiving the keys and you had, 3 to 5 minutes to explain why you're so proud of this build and everything you've put into it, how would you relay that to the new owner of this bike?
Well, to be blunt, the greatest satisfaction is that it's for the Motorcycle Relief Project.
Absolutely.
And they create 1-week rides for military and first responders suffering from severe PTSD. They embed a counseling session at the end of each day of riding, and their success rate has been phenomenal. And so Absolutely. For me, the greatest thing is whoever gets this bike actually helped contribute to the MRP, the Motorcycle Relief Project. And that is really satisfying. Now, I just checked how many raffle tickets we've sold, and we're over 3,200.
Fantastic.
And I'm hoping we hit 5,000 to 6,000 sold. And I think we have enough runway to make that happen. And I've noticed a lot of people were buying, 10 tickets or 6 tickets. Some bought just one. But a lot of people were buying multiple tickets. And it just makes me feel so darn good because I would really like to see this help pay the cost of MRP. And my goal is to pay for what it costs them to run for a year, which is about $100,000 or about 5,000 raffle tickets. It it's still heading forward. So, whoever gets it, you not only have a nice bike, but you help contribute to a really important cause, in my opinion.
Yeah, Brooke, I did not expect that answer, but that's the answer we all needed to hear. I think, the Motorcycle Relief Project, and I've interviewed Mike Bobbitt, who's the current president of the Motorcycle Relief Project.
Yeah.
I mean, you talk about, he can tell you stories of where folks just intended to literally kill themselves after they did the ride. Like, this is my last hurrah. I'm going to go ahead and go home and kill myself. Like, serious intervention for folks with struggling with PTSD and depression in the military and first responder community. So I really appreciate, your take on that and your response on that, because it would be so easy, again, having seen that bike in person, to sit back and say, look at all this work I've done, which you have done a ton. I mean, the bike is just stunning, but instead to pivot to, yeah, the bike's great, but why I did it is even better. And I think that's more than anything anybody could provide in terms of metal and paint and, all that stuff.
Well, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about of the Zen experience.
Right.
To be clear, I enjoyed the work and all of that, but I also reached outward and brought in a group who needs support, which is very gratifying. And so every time I worked on this project, I'd always stop and say, now, whoever buys it, are they going to think it looks really great? And if not, redo the work, because it's got to be number one. It's got to really, really look good. And that was a good motivator.
So it's funny how these questions pop up. If somebody wanted to start what you started in 2009, looking back, or even advice to yourself in 2009, I want to start restoring these vintage motorcycles, all the lessons you've learned, all the bikes you've done, what would you go back and say to yourself, or someone that wants to start doing what you're currently doing?
Well, the first thing that gets in your way is fear that you are going to screw up. And that's the thing I want to combat, which is why I built the website and later added the YouTube videos, which are a summary of the processes that I use. Because if you can see and read what is needed, I think it takes the fear away. You go, okay, I see how that goes together now, and I'm not afraid. I see it. And in some of my articles, I also talk about the mistake I made or mistakes I made and what I do to correct it, because we all screw up. And the thing is, don't be afraid. You can overcome it. The best story I have was when I taught myself how to paint. A friend of mine said, hey, one thing about paint work, Brooke, different than working on an engine, if you screw it up, sandpaper, repaint, you're done. So
that is true.
It is more forgiving in one sense.
Well, and I did ask you about it. Paint's one thing, but I guess the correct terminology, the pinstriping that motorcycle has, it was all done by hand, and it looks very, very good. Whoever the artist was that did that, so props to them. I mean, very well done.
Yeah, it's a guy whose company's called Speedway Graphics, and I've had him do. I actually did do a paint pinstripe, but I used what I call training wheels. There's a stencil, and you put the paint in. Even doing that was hard, but when I watch him, it's just a joy to watch that ability to draw the lines, right thickness, and of course he does make mistakes, cleans them up, fixes it, but it's a joy to watch. It's just so nice. That's the epitome of art and science put together, in my opinion. It's really fantastic.
If you had one wish, we talked about whoever the next owner is going to be, and they're probably going to watch this, but if you had one wish for the life that motorcycle behind you is going to live, what would that wish be?
Well, they should put 100,000 miles on it.
Yes.
And bring it back, and we'll refresh it.
I love that. The old classic, there are people that own motorcycles and there are people who ride them.
It's got over 60 thou on it now, and I put 900 on it to break it in and shake it down. So as I say, yeah, I hope whoever gets this enjoys the bike and says, I'm just going to go ride and ride and ride.
100,000 miles, regular maintenance, that's all it's going to need?
I would think so. I have every confidence that with regular maintenance, you ought to be able to get to 100,000 without any major issues.
And all one has to do is kind of reference your YouTube videos on the build and the literal, like the meticulous nature in which you addressed every single thing. And I think it's probably better than when it was factory new, I would assume.
Well, it could be. Again, I never saw one in the flesh on a showroom floor, unfortunately. But I hope that it, looks at least as good as it might have coming out of the factory.
Absolutely. I think it does. Again, I wasn't there either, but I think, and I've got some really high quality pictures, which hopefully I'll be able to post up here as well, that will demonstrate that. But, you've got this, it's getting auctioned off or raffled off in middle of March. So we did see, I kind of want to talk about your next plan, what's new for 2024 and beyond. There's another build in your garage. If you want to talk a little bit about that, I think that's super fascinating.
Well, Mike Bobbitt gave me a heads up when in the wintertime they do rides out in Tucson, Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a family there contacted him that had a model year 1973 R75/5, and they gave it to him. And he contacted me and he said, I'm going to pick this up and put it in the trailer when we come back. Would you like to just take a look at it for me? And I said, well, I'll tell you what, yeah, I will. But in the end, if you're up for it, I'll be more than happy to just try to restore this thing and put it in great shape. And maybe we can get the MOA Foundation to maybe run another raffle in a couple of years for the vintage bike. And, the R75/5 actually is pretty popular. Well, I'm hoping that that's what we'll be able to do. Now, the other thing that I'm going to do on this project is a lot of the Airhead Beamer Club people here. We're going to do the build as projects for teaching them things. And there's a number of other guys in the group who are equally as good as I am. So we can parcel out some of the work and they can come over to here in my shop and we can show people how you do various things. And I think that would be really a nice way to increase the knowledge, which increases the survivability of airheads, because fewer and fewer dealers provide any airhead service these days. It's pretty much you got to do it on your own, although there are a couple of independents around, like Matt Isles here in Denver, who will work on them. But not everybody is, close to something like that.
Is this I think it is, this is the motorcycle with the very interesting front fairing?
Yeah, it had a Wixom Ranger fairing, and somebody put Dymo tape labels all across the front of all the countries overseas that the bike had been ridden in. And I thought that was fantastic.
And it's not like a short list.
There must be 20 or 25 countries in round numbers. And I just thought, wow, it's a US model, but it ended up overseas. And whoever had it there rode it all over the place.
And these are like exotic. This is not like France. It's like, I think it's like Morocco.
Morocco, a lot of the Yugoslavia breakup countries that I rode in. Yeah, it's just a really cool. And I'm assuming that might have been the third owner. The original owner of that bike that went ahead and rode it. Now, according to the license plate, the last time it was registered was 1988. So It's really, in my mind, it's been off the road for quite a long time. But hey, it was, I think, okay. So when we dig into it, we'll find out.
Yeah. What are your impressions of that? Initial impressions looking at that motorcycle versus the R80 ST, as far as project scope, length go? Do you think it'll be better, worse, about the same?
Well, it's got all its parts.
Ah,
So that's a plus.
bonus.
That's a plus. I'm staring at it, but uh, I think it actually is in pretty decent shape. It
Mm,
needs to, just be gone through. We'll change out all the seals and everything, check out the tranny, make sure the rear drive seals and everything are good. We'll go through the whole thing,
hmm
repaint it, and when we get done, again, the model in my head right now is kind of making it look like it was on the floor, you know, really nice looking,
Yeah,
1973.
absolutely. So I think in wrapping this up, I mean, I think it's absolutely incredible what you're doing. I mean, if you look at all the organizations, so you wanted to restore this vintage motorcycle for a great cause. And then the BMW MOA stepped in and said, "Hey, how can we help?" Because they obviously have the reach. So we're out, they're selling raffle tickets, doing all the things and getting the information out there for a good cause. We're going to, raise a ton of money for an outstanding nonprofit and the Motorcycle Relief Project. I just think it's, between yourself, the BMW MOA, you've got Mike Bobbitt, the MRP, just a great good news story. And ultimately, to your point, maybe about 10 minutes ago, all the folks that are going to benefit from this, like real world benefit from this, you could be literally saving lives funding this organization. So congratulations to you. I don't know if it started out in that way, wanting congratulations, but I think it's a great good news story from somebody that's literally given of their time, effort, blood, sweat, and tears to give back to the community. And that's more rare than you might think these days. So I really appreciate what you're doing. I'll let you kind of wrap it up here with any final thoughts that you want to share with anybody that might be watching this or listening.
Well, to be clear, Darren Dorton, who does the BMW Type 247 podcast, did a podcast on the finished ST.
Okay.
And he, is connected to the MOA. He contacted Ted Moyer to
Mm,
listen to the podcast. And then he sent me a note, Darren did, and said, I think Ted is interested in whether you'd like to have them raffle the bike. And
mm,
he called me and he said, would you be interested? And to me, there'd be more revenue for MRP on a raffle than I could have gotten on my initial plan, which was to auction it and bring a trailer. So I
right.
thought that was just, again, the universe sort of closed in on this and serendipity struck again. And so far, it's been really, really gratifying. So I'm very, very happy that that happened. The reaching out and being helpful to others,
Mm,
that to me is gratifying. All the other builds, I kept the bikes, but I reached a point where I felt like I've got more than I need, but I do like to do the builds. What else could I do? And then it hit me. Why don't you start doing something where it could be sold and the proceeds go to charity? Now, I mentioned that to Euromoto Electrics here in Denver. Norm Schwab owns it.
hmm
And he said, well, Brooke, it's interesting you mentioned that. I've contributed to them too. But on your project, you let me know what you need for parts and I'll get them for you at no cost, which was an enormous uh, piece of serendipity. And I really, really appreciate that tremendously.
And
And over the project, other people donated services or gave me a steep discount or got parts for me. Bud Proven got me a side panel for free. Uh, the transmission rebuild, all I paid for were the parts. Randy Long of Long's Mechanical Services, he donated all the labor. And it was just stuff like that that popped up. And the guy who did the pinstriping at Speedway Graphics, I mentioned, what I was doing with the bike. He said, I'm not charging you for it. I thought, wow, this is really cool. So everybody who, donated has a piece of this. in my opinion. And I hope it made him feel good.
And I think it's very appropriate to wrap up by mentioning that. I mean, this is obviously your project and your build, but there are so many people whose shoulders you're standing on in order to complete this. They're all listed on your website, I believe, but just so many people that contributed either time, effort, parts, all going into, it's almost like a community build, I guess you could say, all for a good cause with a large organization, and Ted Moyer and the BMW MOA stepping in to say, hey, we would like to help this too. And even the people that are buying all the raffle tickets to support it as well. I mean, of course they want to win a motorcycle, but they also know that is all going to a good cause. So an incredible good news story. And I thank you for mentioning everybody that's involved. We obviously can't get to all of them, but I think they are all listed on your site, right?
Yeah, on the project index is a list of all the folks who contributed to the project. You bet.
Man, fantastic. Well, Brooke, I wasn't quite sure how we were going to condense the most interesting man in the world's life down into 1 hour on a podcast, but I think we did a pretty good job. And I think, I know that I'm going to, all the things we've talked about, I'm going to list down below. People can go check them out. But I really thank you for coming on. Thank you for sharing your story. First of all, about motorcycling. Secondly, about the build. And what a good news story this is to be able to share with folks.
Yeah, the other thing is people who see my YouTube videos, they never see this. All they see are my hands doing the work. So now you can see I have a radio face.
Or we see your black gloves. I'm like, is he trying to hide something there? Like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, where I screwed up and have a real big bruise.
Man, well, it's been a great time. I wish we could do more. Maybe we'll have you on again when you're working on your next project that you're helping to teach people to rebuild motorcycles. So, Brook Reams, everybody, thank you for being on the show. Can't wait to get this published so we can get it out, get more people involved. Thank you so much for being on, Brooke.
And thank you for the invitation to talk with you, Phil. I enjoyed our coffee get together, and this has been fun. So God bless you and keep up the good work, my friend.
Thanks, Brooke. I really appreciate it, man. All the best.